I used to believe that happiness was a place you could arrive at, a destination you reached after navigating the right turns in life. You graduated, you found a career that didn't drain your soul, you met someone who felt like coming home, and then you stayed there. You unpacked your bags. You hung pictures on the walls. You built a life inside that quiet, sunlit room called contentment, and you never imagined you'd have to leave it. For 10 years, that's exactly what I thought I'd done. My name is Daniel, and for a decade, my life with Clara felt less like a choice and more like a law of nature, inevitable, steady, reliable. We met in our late 20s at a bookstore during a rainstorm neither of us had anticipated. She was reaching for the same copy of a worn-out poetry collection I'd been eyeing all afternoon. Our fingers brushed against the spine of the book, and she laughed. A sound like wind chimes on a soft breeze, and said, "I suppose the universe wants us to share." We ended up sharing coffee instead, then dinner, then an apartment, then a life. It felt fated in the way young love often does. But unlike so many of those stories, ours didn't curdle with time. It deepened. It matured. It became the quiet hum beneath everything else, the foundation I built my days upon. Our home was a modest 2-story house on the edge of a neighborhood where oak trees arched over the streets like cathedral arches. Clara filled it with the scent of rosemary and lemon, with throw blankets in muted earth tones, with shelves of books she actually read. She was a landscape architect, and she brought that same thoughtful intention to our home. Every plant placed with purpose, every room flowing into the next like a gentle slope in a well-designed garden. She noticed things. The way the morning light hit the kitchen table in October, the exact moment the jasmine by the back porch began to bloom each spring, the subtle shift in my mood when a project at work was weighing on me. She'd bring me tea without asking, rest her hand on my shoulder as she passed behind my chair, hum old folk songs under her breath while chopping vegetables. These weren't grand gestures. They were the mortar between the bricks of our life. And for 10 years, that mortar held. I worked as a freelance graphic designer, which meant my office was our spare bedroom and my hours were my own. Some days I'd finish by 2 p.m. Other days I'd be hunched over my tablet until midnight. Clara never minded. She trusted me implicitly. That was one of the things I loved most about her. In a world of suspicion and second-guessing, Clara moved through our marriage with a quiet certainty that felt like grace. She never checked my phone, never questioned a late night, never asked for passwords or explanations. "I married you because I believe in you," she'd said once, early on, when I jokingly offered to show her my texts. "Not because I need to audit you." That trust was a gift, and like so many gifts we receive without earning, I began to take it for granted. The first crack didn't feel like a crack at all. Felt like static, a faint buzzing at the edge of a clear signal. Started about 14 months ago. I'd been working on a rebrand for a boutique hotel chain. Long hours, tight deadlines, the kind of project that demanded you live inside someone else's aesthetic for weeks at a time. Clara had just landed her biggest commission yet, designing the grounds for a new cultural center downtown. We were both busy, both tired, both proud of each other's successes. But somewhere in that mutual exhaustion, the rhythm between us shifted. It wasn't dramatic.
No slammed doors.
No raised voices. Just distance. I'd come downstairs after a 10-hour work session to find her already in bed, reading with the lamp casting a soft halo around her head. "Long day?" she'd ask, not looking up from her book. "Yeah," I'd say, sitting on the edge of the mattress. "You? Soil samples don't lie, but they do require patience." I'd lean over to kiss her forehead, and she'd tilt her face up at the last second. Not quite meeting my lips, just offering her cheek. A small thing, barely noticeable, but it happened again the next night. And the night after that. A cheek instead of lips. A murmured good night instead of pulling me down beside her. I told myself she was tired. We were both tired. This was just a season, but seasons change. This one lingered. Then came the silences. Not the comfortable, companionable silences we'd always shared. The kind where you could sit together on the couch for an hour. Her sketching, me scrolling through design blogs, neither of us speaking but both feeling utterly connected. These were different, heavy, filled with something unspoken. I'd ask her about her day, and she'd give me a summary so polished it felt rehearsed. The client approved the irrigation plan. The stone supplier delivered early. It was fine. Fine. A word that means everything and nothing. I started noticing other things. The way she'd take her phone into the bathroom with her now. Something she'd never done before. How she'd laugh at a text message with a sound that was just a little too bright, a little too performative, like she was reminding herself to sound happy. Once, I came home early and found her standing in the kitchen, staring out the window at the backyard, completely still. Not lost in thought, not daydreaming, just frozen. When she heard me set my keys on the counter, she startled as if I'd shaken her awake, then turned with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You're home early," she said. "Yeah." Project wrapped sooner than expected. I moved toward her, wanting to wrap my arms around her waist, to feel the solid reality of her against me. She shifted slightly to the left, putting the kitchen island between us. "Great, I'll start dinner." That was the moment I felt it. A cold thread of doubt weaving through my chest. Not suspicion of infidelity. Nothing so crude. Just the unsettling sense that the woman I'd built a life with was slowly, quietly, building a room inside herself I wasn't allowed to enter. And I didn't know how to ask for the key without sounding like I didn't trust her. Which was the cruelest irony of all. Because Clara had given me no reason not to trust her. None. She was still kind. Still responsible. Still the woman who remembered my mother's birthday and called her every year without prompting. Still the one who'd rub my shoulders when I got home from a frustrating client meeting. But something had changed beneath the surface, like a slow leak in a tire you don't notice until the ride gets bumpy. And instead of turning toward her, instead of sitting her down and saying, "Clara, I feel like we're drifting and it scares me," I did what I suspect many men do when faced with emotional uncertainty. I looked for validation elsewhere. It started innocently enough. A freelance copywriter named Maya had been assigned to collaborate with me on a website redesign. We exchanged emails for weeks, professional, efficient, occasionally witty. She had a way with words that made even dry product descriptions feel alive. "The artisanal soap isn't just cleansing," she'd written once. "It's a quiet rebellion against the tyranny of synthetic fragrances." I'd laughed out loud at my desk. When the client requested we meet in person to align on brand voice, I agreed without hesitation. We chose a quiet cafe downtown, neutral territory, all glass and reclaimed wood, and the gentle hiss of an espresso machine. Maya was nothing like I'd imagined. I'd pictured someone severe, all sharp edges and designer glasses. Instead, she was warm, approachable. She wore a soft blue sweater the color of a summer sky, and when she smiled, her whole face lit up. Not just her mouth, but her eyes, crinkling at the corners like she genuinely meant it. We talked shop for 20 minutes. Then the conversation drifted to books we loved, to the absurdity of modern design trends, to our shared hatred of avocado toast. 2 hours later, the cafe was closing, and we were still talking. Not about work, about us. The parts of ourselves we showed the world, and the parts we kept hidden. "I think we all wear masks," she said, stirring her cold tea absently. "Especially in relationships. We become what our partners need us to be. The supportive one, the stable one, the fun one. After a while, you forget which parts are really you." Her words settled deep in my chest, resonating with that unnamed ache I'd been carrying. I didn't tell her about Clara. Not then. But I listened, really listened, as she spoke about the loneliness of being misunderstood, even by people who loved you. And when she said, "Sometimes you just need someone to see you, not the role you play, just you," I felt a dangerous, thrilling sense of being understood. We started meeting for coffee every few weeks. Strictly professional, I told myself, though our conversations rarely stayed on brand guidelines or typography choices. We talked about dreams we'd abandoned, regrets we carried quietly, the small griefs of adulthood no one prepares you for. With Maya, I felt lighter, seen, like I could exhale a breath I'd been holding for months. I never intended for it to become more than friendship. I swear I didn't. But loneliness is a slow poison. And when your marriage, which you've always believed to be your sanctuary, starts to feel like a beautifully furnished room you're no longer welcome in. Even the smallest kindness from a stranger can feel like salvation. The first time I crossed a line, it wasn't physical. It was a text message sent late one night after a particularly hollow evening with Clara. She'd fallen asleep on the couch while I was still working. I'd covered her with a blanket, kissed her hair, and gone upstairs alone. My phone buzzed. A meme from Maya about designers who use Comic Sans unironically. I laughed, and then, without thinking, I typed back, "Wish you were here to laugh with me." I stared at the words on the screen. They hung there, innocent and devastating. I could delete them, pretend I'd never typed them. But something in me, a tired, lonely part one didn't recognize, refused. I hit send. Her reply came 30 seconds later, "Me too." And just like that, the boundary shifted. Not with a bang, but with a whisper. The meetings became more frequent. The conversations more intimate. We never kissed. Never touched beyond a brief hug, hello and goodbye. But we built something between us. A secret world of shared glances and inside jokes and texts that lived in a separate folder on my phone. Hidden behind an innocuous name, Project Horizon. A lie wrapped in a lie. I told myself it was harmless. That I wasn't hurting anyone. That Clara was already emotionally distant. Wasn't I just filling a void she'd created? I became an architect of my own justification, building elaborate mental structures to support a truth I refused to face. I was choosing to look away from my marriage instead of fighting for it. And in doing so, I was becoming someone I didn't recognize. The affair, if you could even call it that, with its chaste coffees and emotionally charged texts, lasted 3 months. 3 months of stolen moments and quiet guilt. 3 months of coming home to Clara and feeling like an imposter in my own life. I'd watch her move through our kitchen, humming that same folk song, and feel a surge of love so sharp it was painful. This is what matters. A voice inside me would whisper, this real, complicated, beautiful life. And then I'd silence it, reach for my phone when she wasn't looking, and text Maya about how much I missed her. I was living in 2 worlds, and I was failing in both. The unraveling began on an ordinary Tuesday in late September. The air had just turned crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke and decaying leaves. Clara had been distant for days, more than usual. She'd taken to spending evenings in her studio, the small converted shed in our backyard where she drafted her landscape plans. She'd emerge hours later with ink-stained fingers and a faraway look in her eyes. That Tuesday, I decided to surprise her. I made her favorite pasta, lemon ricotta with peas, and carried a tray out to the studio. I wanted to bridge the distance, to remind her and myself of who we were together. I knocked lightly on the studio door. No answer. I pushed it open. The space was empty, but her drafting table wasn't. Spread across its surface were not landscape plans or soil charts. They were photographs, dozens of them, black and white, faded at the edges, held down by drafting weights. And in the center of the table, next to an open journal filled with handwriting I didn't recognize, sat a single object that made my blood run cold. A silver locket. The same locket Clara had worn every day for the first 5 years of our marriage. The one she told me was a gift from her grandmother. The one she'd stopped wearing 2 years ago after the clasp broke. The one I'd assumed was tucked away in her jewelry box. Except here it was, open. And inside weren't the tiny portraits of her grandparents she'd always described. Inside was a photograph of a young woman with Clara's eyes, but a harder, angrier set to her mouth. A woman I'd never seen before. Beneath the locket lay a single sheet of paper. At the top, typed in a clean, professional font, were 2 words that stopped my breath. Case file. And beneath that, a name I didn't know. But the photograph beside it, the woman in that photograph was Maya. My Maya. The world tilted. The tray in my hands trembled. Pasta sauce sloshed over the edge of the ceramic bowl. Because in that moment, with the scent of rosemary and lemon still clinging to my clothes and the taste of our shared life still fresh on my tongue, I understood with chilling certainty. Nothing was as it seemed, and I had just walked into a story I didn't know I was part of. Time didn't stop in that moment. fractured. The tray slipped from my hands. Ceramic shattered against the wooden floorboards, sending shards skittering across the room like startled insects. Pasta and sauce splattered across Clara's drafting papers. A violent splash of yellow against precise ink lines and faded photographs. I didn't hear the crash. Not really. Sound had receded to a dull hum, as if I'd been submerged underwater. My eyes remained locked on the locket. My Maya. The words echoed in my skull. Absurd and impossible. Maya wasn't anyone's but herself. The warm, blue-sweatered woman who made me feel seen during those lonely afternoons in coffee shops. She was separate from my life with Clara. A compartment. A secret garden I'd built behind a door I never meant to open fully. And now here she was, spilled across my wife's drafting table like evidence at a crime scene. I stepped forward, my shoes crunching on broken ceramic. I didn't care about the mess. I barely registered my own body moving. My hand reached out, trembling, and lifted the locket. It was cold, heavier than I remembered. The silver was tarnished along the edges, worn smooth in places where fingers had worried it for years. I'd seen Clara touch it absently during difficult conversations, thumb stroking its curve while she gathered her thoughts. I'd assumed it was a nervous habit, a comfort object. Now I wondered, had she been reminding herself of something? Or someone? I flipped it open again. The photograph inside showed a young woman, maybe 18 or 19, standing beneath a willow tree. Her hair was longer than Maya's, darker, pulled back in a loose braid. But the eyes, God, the eyes were identical. The same shape, the same deep brown that seemed to hold flecks of amber when caught by light. The same slight tilt to the left that made her look perpetually curious. But where Maya's face radiated warmth, this girl's expression was guarded, defiant, a challenge in her gaze as if daring the camera, and whoever held it, to underestimate her. Beneath the locket lay the case file. I picked it up with fingers that felt numb, disconnected from my will. Case file Eleanor Voss. Status: closed, presumed deceased. Date of disappearance: October 17, 1998. Eleanor Voss. The name meant nothing to me, but the date, 1998. Clara would have been 10 years old then, barely a child. My eyes scanned further down the page. Standard missing person details. Height, weight, distinguishing features. Scar above left eyebrow. Birthmark on right shoulder blade, shape of crescent moon. Then a section labeled family connections. Father, Robert Voss, deceased, 2005. Mother, Margaret Voss, remarried, 2001. Sister, Clara Voss, age 10 at time of disappearance. The paper slipped from my grasp. Clara Voss, not Clara Miller, her name after we married. Clara Voss, her maiden name, which she rarely used, which I'd only seen on old tax documents and the deed to our house. Clara Voss, sister to a missing girl named Eleanor. My wife had a sister. She had never mentioned it. Not once in 10 years. Not when we talked about our childhoods over wine on lazy Sundays. Not when she described her mother, a quiet woman named Helen who visited twice a year and always brought homemade jam. Not when she'd tearfully recounted her father's death from cancer when she was 16. There had been no sister in any of those stories. No ghost hovering at the edges of her past. Just silence. I sank into the rolling chair beside the drafting table, the wheels squeaking in protest. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. Breathe, I told myself. Just breathe. But my lungs refused to cooperate. Each inhale felt shallow, insufficient. What was happening? The rational part of my brain, the designer who solved visual problems with clean lines and logical hierarchies, tried to assemble the pieces into a harmless pattern. Coincidence, it whispered. Maya simply resembles this missing girl. People share features all the time. It means nothing. But another part of me, deeper and older, knew better. Knew that the universe rarely dealt in such precise coincidences. That the locket Clara had worn for years, her locket, she'd said, contained a photo of a girl who looked exactly like the woman I'd been emotionally entangled with for 3 months. That Clara had hidden this case file in her private studio, surrounded by photographs I hadn't been meant to see, and that Maya, my warm, understanding Maya, had known my name before we met at that cafe. I replayed our first in-person meeting in my mind, the way she'd smiled when I walked in. "Daniel," she'd said, extending her hand, "I've heard so much about your work." I'd assumed the project manager had briefed her, but now I wondered, had she known more than just my professional reputation? Had she known about me? About Clara? A cold dread began to pool in my stomach. I turned my attention to the photographs scattered across the table. Most were black and white, obviously old, faded edges, the soft grain of film photography. They showed a family. A stern-looking man with thinning hair, Robert Voss, I presumed. A gentle-faced woman with Clara's smile, Margaret. A young Clara with pigtails and a gap-toothed grin, and Eleanor. Always Eleanor. Sometimes alone, sometimes with Clara. In one photo, the two girls sat on a porch swing, arms slung around each other's shoulders, heads tilted together in sisterly conspiracy. They looked inseparable. In another, Eleanor stood apart from the family group, arms crossed, gaze directed somewhere beyond the camera, already separate, already alone. But it was the newer photographs that chilled me most. Color prints, recent. One showed Maya, Eleanor, standing outside a bookstore I frequented. Another captured her waiting at a crosswalk 3 blocks from my office. A third showed her sitting at the very cafe where we'd had our first meeting, glancing toward the door as if expecting someone, as if expecting me. My stomach lurched. I covered my mouth with my hand, fighting a wave of nausea. This wasn't coincidence. This was orchestration. Every meeting, every chance encounter, every text message that arrived precisely when I was feeling most disconnected from Clara. Had it all been planned? Had I been led gently, skillfully, down a path someone else had laid out for me? But why? The question hung in the air of the studio, thick and suffocating. Why would Clara's long-lost sister, if that's who Maya truly was, engineer an emotional affair with her sister's husband? What possible motive could justify such a cruel, intricate deception? Unless it wasn't about me at all. Unless I was merely a pawn, a tool, a way to get to Clara. The thought landed with the force of a physical blow. I doubled over in the chair, elbows on my knees, head in my hands. For 10 years, I had believed my marriage was a sanctuary, a place of mutual trust and quiet devotion. And now I was staring at evidence that suggested my entire life might be built on a foundation of secrets I couldn't even name. What had happened to Eleanor Voss in 1998? Why had Clara never spoken of her? Why had their mother remarried and seemingly erased this chapter of their family history? And where had Eleanor been for the past 28 years? Most importantly, was the woman I knew as Maya truly Eleanor returned? Or was she someone else entirely, using Eleanor's identity as a weapon? Footsteps on the gravel path outside the studio. I jerked upright, my body flooding with adrenaline. Clara. She was coming. I had seconds, maybe less, to decide what to do. Panic seized me. Should I pretend I hadn't seen anything? Try to clean the mess before she arrived? But the broken ceramic was everywhere. The sauce stained her papers. There was no hiding this. Or should I confront her? Demand answers while the evidence was still spread before us like an accusation? The door handle turned. I didn't move. I sat frozen in the chair, the locket still clutched in my hand, the case file at my feet. The door swung open, and Clara stood silhouetted against the golden evening light filtering through the oak trees. She took in the scene in a single sweeping glance: the shattered tray, the splattered food, the photographs scattered across her drafting table, me sitting amidst the wreckage with her sister's locket in my palm. Her face did not register surprise, or anger, or confusion. It registered resignation, as if she had been expecting this moment for a very long time. She stepped inside, closing the door softly behind her. The click of the latch sounded unnaturally loud in the silence. For a long moment, we simply looked at each other. Two people who had shared a bed, a home, a life for 10 years, now separated by a chasm neither of us knew how to cross. Then Clara spoke, her voice quiet but steady. "So you found her." 3 words. That was all it took to shatter the world I thought I knew. "You have a sister," I said, my voice barely a whisper. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation wrapped in disbelief. "I had a sister," Clara corrected gently. "Eleanor disappeared when I was 10. The police searched for months. They never found her. Eventually, they stopped looking." She moved farther into the studio, her eyes fixed on the locket in my hand. "That belonged to her. She gave it to me the night before she vanished. Told me to keep it safe." "Why didn't you ever tell me?" The question came out sharper than I intended, edged with a hurt I couldn't name. 10 years, Clara. 10 years of marriage. And you never once mentioned you had a sister who disappeared. Clara's gaze dropped to the floor. When she looked up again, her eyes were glistening. "Some wounds don't heal. They just scab over." Talking about Eleanor, it would have ripped that scab off. For both of us. She gestured to the case file. "That's why I keep these things hidden. Not because I'm ashamed of her, but because the pain of losing her, it never really goes away. It just changes shape. I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted to." The Clara standing before me, the woman with tears in her eyes speaking of childhood grief, felt real. Familiar. This was the Clara I'd married. Compassionate, vulnerable, carrying quiet sorrows she rarely shared. But then I remembered Maya's smile. The way she'd listened to me with such perfect empathy. The texts that always arrived when I needed them most. "How did Maya get involved?" I asked, my voice trembling. "The copywriter I've been working with. She looks exactly like Eleanor. Is it her? Is she your sister?" Clara went very still. The color drained from her face. "You've been seeing her?" The question hung between us, loaded with implications I wasn't ready to face. Seeing her, such a simple phrase, could mean so many things. Coffee meetings, text messages, emotional intimacy, betrayal. "I didn't know who she was," I said quickly, the words tumbling out in a desperate rush. "I swear to you, Clara, I had no idea she might be connected to you. We started working together on a project and we became friends. That's all. Just friends." But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. Friendship didn't involve late-night texts saying "I miss you." Friendship didn't create a secret world you retreated to when your marriage felt hollow. And friendship certainly didn't involve the sharp, guilty thrill I felt every time my phone buzzed with her name. Clara studied my face, and I saw the exact moment she understood. The subtle shift in her expression, the softening of her features into something resembling pity. Not anger, not betrayal, pity. As if she were looking at a child who'd accidentally broken a precious vase, not understanding the value of what he'd shattered. "Oh, Daniel," she whispered, and in that single phrase, I heard everything I feared. Disappointment, sorrow, and a terrible, dawning certainty that I had played a part in a drama far larger than my own loneliness. "Tell me the truth," I begged, my voice cracking. "Is Maya your sister? Is Eleanor alive?" Clara walked to the drafting table and gently gathered the scattered photographs, stacking them with careful precision. She didn't answer right away. When she finally spoke, her words were measured, deliberate, as if choosing each one from a limited supply. "Eleanor disappeared the night of our 10th birthday," she said softly. "We were supposed to have a joint party. Cake, presents, our cousins coming over. But that afternoon we had a fight. A stupid fight about, I don't even remember what, something trivial. She said things. I said things. And when our parents called us in for dinner, she wasn't in her room. We thought she was hiding, being dramatic. But she never came back." Clara's hands trembled slightly as she placed the stack of photos beside the case file. "The police thought she might have run away. She'd been difficult that year. Angry, withdrawn. Our parents were going through a rough patch. Dad had lost his job, money was tight. Eleanor took it hard. She blamed Mom, blamed Dad, blamed me sometimes." A tear traced a path down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. But she was my sister, my best friend. She wouldn't have just left me. Not like that. Not without a word. She looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw the ghost of that 10-year-old girl still living in her eyes. The girl who'd lost her sister and spent a lifetime wondering why. The official story was that she ran away, Clara continued. But I never believed it. Not really. Something happened that night, Daniel. Something our parents knew about but refused to talk about. After Eleanor vanished, our mother changed. She became fragile. Dad grew distant. They stopped speaking to certain relatives. And when Mom remarried a few years later, she legally changed both our names, hers and mine. Voss became Miller. It was like she was trying to erase our past entirely. She paused, swallowing hard. I've spent 28 years trying to understand what happened to my sister. Hiring private investigators. Digging through old records. Following every lead that went nowhere. And 6 months ago, I got a letter. My breath caught. From Eleanor? Clara nodded slowly. Not signed with her name, but it had details only she would know. The location of a hiding spot we'd shared as children. A song lyric we used as a secret code. And one other thing. She reached into the pocket of her cardigan and withdrew a small, folded piece of paper. She handed it to me. I opened it with trembling fingers. The handwriting was elegant, precise, feminine but firm. He doesn't know who he's really married to, Clara. But he will. And when he does, he'll understand why I had to come back.
No signature.
No return address. Just those 2 sentences, typed on a vintage typewriter with a slightly faded ribbon. I read them 3 times before looking up at Clara. What does this mean? Who he's really married to? What aren't you telling me? Clara's face crumpled. Not with guilt, with grief. A deep, abiding sorrow that seemed to radiate from her very bones. Daniel, she said, her voice barely audible. What if everything you think you know about me, about us, is built on a lie? The question hung in the air between us, heavy with implication. Outside, the wind rustled through the oak trees, carrying the scent of coming rain. Inside the studio, surrounded by the ghosts of a family I never knew existed, I felt the ground beneath my feet begin to dissolve. And I realized with terrifying clarity, I had no idea who my wife really was. The rain began just after Clara asked that question, the one that unraveled everything. What if everything you think you know about me, about us, is built on a lie? A soft patter at first, tapping against the studio's single window like hesitant fingers. Then heavier, a steady rhythm that filled the silence between us. Clara didn't move toward the window to watch it fall. She kept her eyes locked on mine, as if afraid that if she looked away, I'd vanish, or worse, that I'd see the truth in her face before she was ready to speak it. I wanted to stand up, to pace, to do anything that would burn off the frantic energy humming beneath my skin. But my body had gone heavy, rooted to the chair as if the floor had grown around my feet. All I could do was stare at her. The woman I'd kissed goodbye that morning, whose coffee mug still sat drying on the dish rack, whose scent of rosemary and lemon still clung to the sweater draped over the back of my office chair, and try to reconcile her with the stranger standing before me now. Tell me, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Whatever it is, just tell me. Clara sank onto a low stool beside the drafting table, her shoulders slumping as if the weight of the last 28 years had finally settled onto her bones. She folded her hands in her lap, a gesture so familiar it ached. This was how she sat when delivering difficult news to clients. Calm, composed, choosing her words with care. When Eleanor disappeared, she began, her gaze fixed on her interlaced fingers. My parents told everyone she'd run away. A troubled teenager, they said, acting out. They filed a missing person report, of course, cooperated with police. But privately they seemed almost relieved. The words landed like stones in still water, sending ripples through my understanding of the woman I'd married. Relieved, not devastated, not shattered. Relieved. What are you saying? I whispered. Clara's eyes lifted to meet mine, and in them I saw a lifetime of carrying a secret too heavy for one person to bear. I'm saying my parents weren't who I thought they were, Daniel. And neither was I. She took a slow breath, as if preparing to dive into deep water. A year after Eleanor vanished, my mother sat me down at the kitchen table. I was 11. She held my hands, just like this, and told me something she said I must never repeat to anyone. Not my friends, not my teachers, not even my diary. Clara's voice dropped, becoming almost hypnotic in its quiet intensity. She told me that Robert Voss, the man I'd called Dad my entire life, wasn't my biological father. That my real father was a man named Thomas Reed, who'd had an affair with my mother when I was an infant. That Robert had known. That he'd stayed anyway, out of some sense of duty or pride, but that the knowledge had poisoned him, made him cold, distant, especially toward Eleanor. Why especially toward Eleanor? I asked, though a cold dread was already coiling in my stomach. Because Eleanor was Robert's daughter, Clara said softly. Biologically, completely, and I wasn't. The rain intensified outside, drumming against the roof like impatient hands. I felt the world tilt again. Not the sharp fracture of earlier, but a slow, sickening rotation, as if the axis of my reality had shifted beneath me. You're saying Eleanor was your half-sister? Clara shook her head, a single, sharp motion.
No.
Not half. Whole. At least, that's what I believed until that day at the kitchen table. My mother told me Eleanor was Robert's biological child, and I was Thomas Reed's. She said Robert had resented me for it, resented raising another man's daughter while his own flesh and blood watched from the sidelines. She said that resentment had festered until he did something unforgivable. I didn't want to ask, but I had to. What did he do? Clara's jaw tightened. She never said explicitly, only that something happened the night Eleanor disappeared, something involving Robert and Eleanor that couldn't be undone. That Eleanor hadn't run away. She'd been forced to leave. For her own protection, Mom said, and that if the truth ever came out, Robert would go to prison. Our family would be destroyed, and I'd grow up knowing my stepfather was a monster. She looked at me then, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Can you imagine being 11 years old and hearing that? Being told the man who tucked you in at night, who taught you to ride a bike, who carried you on his shoulders at the zoo, was capable of something so terrible he had to hide his own daughter to protect himself? And then being sworn to secrecy, told that speaking the truth would destroy what was left of your family. I could imagine it, vividly. I saw a small girl with pigtails, Clara at 11, sitting at a Formica kitchen table, her world collapsing in slow motion while rain tapped against the window just as it was tapping now. I saw her absorbing that secret like a sponge, carrying it into adolescence, into adulthood, into our marriage. I saw how it might shape a person. The hypervigilance, the need for control, the quiet rooms built inside herself where no one else could enter. But something didn't fit. If your mother told you all this, why did she change your name after remarrying? Why erase the Voss name entirely? Clara's expression shifted just slightly. A flicker of something I couldn't name crossed her features before she smoothed it away. Grief makes people do strange things, Daniel. After Robert died in 2005, Mom, she wanted a fresh start, a new identity. For both of us. It was a reasonable answer, almost too reasonable, like a sentence she'd rehearsed many times. And Eleanor? Pressed. Did your mother ever say what happened to her after she left? Only that she was safe, living with a relative on our mother's side, a great-aunt in another state. That she'd been told I died in a car accident shortly after her disappearance. Clean break, Mom said, for both our protections. The cruelty of that detail stole my breath. To tell one sister the other was dead. To sever that bond so completely, I thought of the photograph on the drafting table. Two girls on a porch swing, arms slung around each other's shoulders, heads tilted together in sisterly conspiracy. To rip that apart so violently, why would she do that? I asked, my voice thick with emotion. Why not just let you say goodbye? Clara's gaze dropped to her hands again. Because secrets require clean breaks, Daniel. Because once you start lying to protect people, the lies have to grow deeper to hold. Because, she hesitated, then whispered, because I think my mother was afraid Eleanor would come back for me. The words hung in the air between us, charged with implication. Come back for me, not come back to me. For me, as if Clara were something to be claimed, or reclaimed. Before I could ask what she meant, a sound cut through the rhythm of the rain. A soft chime from Clara's phone, resting on the edge of the drafting table. A text message notification. Clara didn't move to check it, but her entire body went rigid. The careful composure she'd maintained since entering the studio fractured for a single, telling second. A sharp intake of breath, a tightening around her eyes, a subtle shift in her posture that screamed recognition. That tiny reaction told me everything I needed to know. She knew who was texting, and she was afraid of it. Who is it? I asked quietly. Clara's eyes flickered toward the phone, then back to me. It doesn't matter. The hell it doesn't. I stood up, my legs shaky but holding. Clara, I've just learned my wife has a sister she never told me about. A sister who may or may not be the woman I've been emotionally involved with for the past 3 months. A sister whose disappearance might involve criminal acts by the man I thought was your father. And now you get a text that makes you look like you've seen a ghost. So yes, it matters. Who is it? The rain fell harder. Somewhere in the house, a branch scraped against the roof like fingernails on glass. Clara stood slowly, deliberately. She walked to the drafting table and placed her hand over her phone, shielding the screen from my view. Daniel, she said, her voice low and measured. There are things you don't understand. Things I haven't told you because I was trying to protect you. Protect me? The words came out sharper than I intended, edged with a decade of accumulated trust now feeling like naivety. From what? From the truth? From your sister? From Eleanor? Clara said, and for the first time, I heard genuine fear in her voice. Not performative fear, not manipulative fear, the raw, unvarnished terror of someone who believes they're in real danger. If that text is from her, and I think it is, then she knows you've seen these things. She knows the game has changed. Game, I repeated, the word tasting like ash in my mouth. What game, Clara? What the hell is happening? Clara's eyes glistened with tears she refused to shed. When I received that letter 6 months ago, the one with the typewritten message, I knew Eleanor was coming back. I knew she'd spent 28 years believing I was dead. And I knew that when she discovered the truth, that I'd lived a full, happy life while she'd been exiled, she wouldn't see it as a tragedy. She'd see it as a betrayal. She took a step toward me, her hands outstretched as if to bridge the widening chasm between us. She spent decades building a narrative in her head, Daniel. A story where our mother was the villain, Robert was the monster, and I was the innocent victim who died because of their sins. But what happens when the victim turns out to have thrived? When the dead sister built a beautiful life, married a kind man, bought a home, created art that touched people, while she was alone, grieving, surviving on scraps of memory. Clara's voice broke on the last word. Surviving. That's the key, don't you see? She didn't just lose me. She lost her entire family, her identity, her childhood. And now she's back, and she's discovered the sister she mourned isn't just alive. She's happy. And happiness after betrayal. That's the one thing a wounded heart can't forgive. I stared at her, trying to process the enormity of what she was describing. A woman returning after decades of grief to find the sister she'd mourned not only alive but flourishing. The psychological devastation of that discovery. I could almost understand the rage it might ignite. Almost. But something still didn't fit. If Eleanor believes you betrayed her, why come after me? Why engineer an emotional affair with your husband? Why not just confront you directly? Clara's face went pale. Because to her, you're not just my husband. You're proof. Tangible, living proof that I moved on. That I built a life without her. That I didn't spend 28 years grieving her the way she grieved me. She swallowed hard. And because she knows how to hurt me. She knows that taking the one person I truly love, the one good, uncomplicated thing in my life, would destroy me more completely than any direct attack ever could. The logic was twisted, psychologically brutal, but it made a terrible kind of sense. Except for one detail that had been nagging at me since I first saw Maya's photograph on that case file. Clara, I said slowly, choosing my words with care, when did you first suspect Maya, the copywriter, might be Eleanor? Clara hesitated, just a fraction of a second. But I saw it, the tiny flicker of calculation behind her eyes before she answered. About 2 months ago, when you mentioned working with a copywriter named Maya. I looked her up online, saw her photograph. The resemblance was uncanny. And you didn't think to mention this to me? I asked, my voice quiet but firm. Your long-lost sister might be collaborating professionally with your husband, and you said nothing? I was trying to protect you, Clara insisted, her voice rising for the first time. I didn't want to poison your work relationship with my family drama. I thought if I investigated quietly, I could determine whether she truly was Eleanor before involving you, before risking everything. By investigating quietly, I said, do you mean by following her? Taking those photographs of her outside my office at the cafe? Clara flinched as if struck. I needed to know her patterns, her intentions. I hired a private investigator, Daniel. Legally, ethically. Those photographs were part of his report. Legally, ethically. The words felt hollow, like labels applied to actions that existed in moral gray zones. And the locket? I asked. Why was it here on your drafting table next to her case file? Why not keep it locked away if it's such a painful reminder? Clara's composure cracked then. Not dramatically, but in a slow unraveling I found more unsettling than any outburst. Her shoulders slumped. Her hands, which had been clenched at her sides, fell limp. She looked suddenly exhausted, older. Because I've been wearing it again, she whispered, for the past month. Since I confirmed Maya was Eleanor, I started wearing it under my clothes, this locket that belonged to her, to remind myself of who I was dealing with, to remember the girl she was before everything broke. She reached up and unbuttoned the top button of her blouse, then the next, revealing the delicate silver chain I hadn't noticed beneath her collar. There, resting against her collarbone, was an identical locket. Same tarnished silver, same delicate filigree. I wear hers, she said softly, to remember the sister I lost, and I kept this one here. She gestured to the locket still clutched in my hand. To remember the weapon she might have become. The poetry of her words should have moved me. Instead, it raised the hairs on my arms. The weapon she might have become. Such a deliberate phrase. Such a calculated framing. I looked down at the locket in my palm. The one I'd believed belonged to Clara for 5 years. The one she'd told me was a gift from her grandmother. I thought of all the times I'd seen her touch it absently during difficult conversations. Had she been reminding herself of Eleanor? Or had she been performing grief for an audience of one me? A terrible thought occurred to me then. A possibility so dark I almost dismissed it immediately. But the pieces kept clicking into place with a dreadful precision. Clara, I said, my voice barely audible over the rain. When you told me this locket was a gift from your grandmother, was that true? Clara's eyes widened slightly, not with confusion, with something closer to alarm. Daniel, just answer the question. Was it true? She looked away, toward the rain-streaked window. No, she admitted softly. It wasn't. Whose was it, Clara? Really? She turned back to me, her expression unreadable. It was Eleanor's. She gave it to me the night she disappeared. Just as I told you. But you told me it was your grandmother's for 5 years. I pressed. You let me believe a lie. Why? Because some truths are too heavy to carry alone. She burst out, her composure finally breaking. Tears spilled down her cheeks. Because I was ashamed, Daniel. Ashamed that my family was built on lies. Ashamed that the man who raised me might have hurt my sister. Ashamed that my own mother participated in the cover-up. And yes, ashamed that I'd lived this beautiful, privileged life while my sister suffered God knows what for 28 years. She sank onto the stool again, her body trembling with the force of her confession. Do you have any idea what it's like to carry that? To look at your happy marriage, your lovely home, your fulfilling career, and know it all exists because someone else was sacrificed? Because your sister was erased so you could have a normal childhood? Every time you complimented that locket, every time you asked about my family, I felt like a fraud, like I was living a life that belonged to someone else. Her grief felt real, palpable. I wanted to believe it was genuine. I needed to believe it because the alternative was too terrifying to consider. But then I remembered Maya's words during one of our coffee meetings, spoken with casual intimacy that now felt calculated. Sometimes the people closest to us hide the deepest wounds, not because they don't trust us, but because the truth would change how we see them forever. At the time, I'd thought she was speaking philosophically, offering wisdom. Now I wondered, had she been planting seeds, preparing me for this moment, teaching me to question the woman I'd married? I looked at Clara, really looked at her, seeing not just the wife I loved, but the layers beneath. The girl who lost her sister, the daughter who learned her father might be a monster, the woman who built a life on a foundation of secrets. And beneath all that, who was she truly? Clara, I said softly. Look at me. She lifted her tear-streaked face. If Eleanor truly believes I'm proof of your betrayal, if she spent months engineering an emotional connection with me to hurt you, then why hasn't she revealed herself to me yet? Why maintain the charade of being Maya the copywriter, when a simple "I'm Clara's sister" would have devastated me, and by extension you far more efficiently? Clara stared at me, her expression shifting from grief to something more complex, something that looked dangerously like calculation. And in that moment, I saw it, the faintest flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. Not the uncertainty of someone caught in a lie, but the uncertainty of someone realizing their story wasn't holding together. Before she could answer, her phone chimed again. Louder this time, insistent. She glanced at the screen, and her face went completely white. What is it? I asked, my heart hammering. Clara looked up at me, her eyes wide with something I'd never seen in them before. Not fear of Eleanor, not grief for her lost sister, but pure, unadulterated panic. It's not from Eleanor, she whispered. Then who? Clara's voice dropped to a breathless hush. It's from Maya. The name landed between us like a detonation. Maya. Not Eleanor. Maya. As if they were two different people. As if the woman I'd been texting for 3 months had no connection to the missing sister whose photograph lay on the table between us. But that was impossible. The resemblance was too precise, the orchestration too deliberate. Unless Clara was lying, unless both women were lying, unless I wasn't caught between two sisters with a tragic history, but between two women playing a game whose rules I didn't yet understand. Clara stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. We need to leave. Now. Why? What did the text say? She shook her head, already moving toward the studio door. There's no time to explain. Just trust me, Daniel. Please. For once, just trust me. But trust was a currency I could no longer afford to spend blindly. I remained seated, the locket still clutched in my hand. Show me the text, Clara, or I'm not going anywhere. The rain fell harder. The wind rose, shaking the old oak trees surrounding our home. And in that moment, surrounded by photographs of a family I never knew existed, holding a locket that belonged to a ghost, facing a wife whose truth I could no longer recognize, I understood with chilling clarity. I was no longer the protagonist in my own life. I was a character in someone else's story, and the next line of dialogue would determine whether I survived it. Would you like me to continue with part 4? Yes.
Мысль завершена.
Part 4. Clara stood frozen in the doorway, one hand on the knob, the other clutching her phone so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Rain lashed against the studio windows, distorting the world outside into a watercolor blur of gray and green. The air smelled of wet wood, spilled pasta sauce, and something else. Something sharp and metallic that I realized was my own fear. Show me the text, I repeated, my voice quieter now but no less firm. Clara, please. For a long moment I thought she might refuse, might bolt through that door and disappear into the storm, leaving me alone with photographs of ghosts and a locket that felt suddenly heavy as a stone in my palm. But then her shoulders slumped, not in surrender, but in exhaustion. The fight drained out of her all at once, leaving behind a woman who looked decades older than the one I'd kissed goodbye that morning. She turned slowly and held out her phone. The screen glowed in the dim studio light, illuminating her face from below like a campfire storyteller's. Maya, I know you're with him right now. Tell him the truth about who you really are, or I will. Beneath it, a second message sent 30 seconds later. Maya, and Daniel, if you're reading this, ask her about the night of October 17th, 1998. Ask her where she really was when Eleanor vanished. The phone trembled in Clara's hand. Or maybe it was my own hand trembling as I reached for it. I didn't take the device. I just stared at those words until they burned themselves into my memory. Ask her where she really was when Eleanor vanished. The implication hung between us, poisonous and precise. Not what happened to Eleanor. Not why did she disappear. But where was Clara? As if Clara's location that night mattered. As if Clara's actions or inactions had played a role in her sister's disappearance. I looked from the phone to Clara's face. Really looked. And for the first time I saw past the wife I loved. The woman who hummed folk songs while chopping vegetables, who remembered my mother's birthday without prompting, who built beautiful gardens for a living, and saw the girl she'd been at 10 years old. The girl who'd fought with her sister the night before she vanished. The girl who'd been told her stepfather might be a monster. The girl who'd been sworn to a secret too heavy for small shoulders to carry. And I wondered, what does a child do with a secret like that? Does she bury it deep and build a life on top of it, hoping the ground never gives way? Or does she reshape the secret, mold it into something more bearable, something that places the blame elsewhere? Clara, I said softly, where were you the night Eleanor disappeared? Her eyes widened. Not with surprise, she'd clearly anticipated the question, but with something closer to terror. The kind of terror that comes not from being accused, but from being known. I was home, she whispered. In my room, reading. I told the police that. I told them 100 times. But you didn't tell me, I said. In 10 years of marriage, you never once mentioned you had a sister who vanished. You never mentioned the fight you had with her that afternoon. You never mentioned your stepfather's alleged actions. You built our entire life together on a foundation of silence. It wasn't silence, she burst out, her voice cracking. It was protection. I was protecting you from a pain that wasn't yours to carry. I was protecting our marriage from a ghost that would have haunted us every day. Don't you see? Some truths don't set you free, Daniel. Some truths just poison everything they touch. Like the truth that your husband was being manipulated by your long-lost sister? I asked, the words tasting bitter. Was that a poison you were willing to let seep into our marriage? Watching me pull away from you, watching me become distant, knowing all along it was her doing it, and saying nothing? Clara flinched as if I'd struck her. I didn't know for certain it was her at first, and when I suspected, I thought I could handle it. I thought if I confronted her quietly, I could make her leave without you ever knowing, without destroying what we have. And did you confront her? I asked. Did you meet with Maya and tell her to stay away from your husband? Clara hesitated. That tiny pause, the space between breaths where truth and lie wrestle for dominance, told me everything. No, she admitted finally. I didn't. Why not? Because... She looked down at her hands, twisting the silver ring I'd given her on our 5th anniversary. Because when I saw her, at that cafe waiting for you, I saw my sister. Not the weapon I'd feared. Just Eleanor, older, harder around the edges, but still my sister. And I couldn't do it, Daniel. I couldn't send her away again. Not after 28 years. The raw pain in her voice undid something in me. For a moment, I saw only the tragedy of it. 2 sisters separated by a lie, reunited through manipulation. both wounded in ways I couldn't fully comprehend. I wanted to believe her. God, how I wanted to believe the woman I'd loved for a decade was simply a victim of circumstance. A woman trying to protect her marriage while wrestling with the ghost of her past. But then I remembered Maya's words during our third coffee meeting, spoken with that uncanny empathy that now felt like reconnaissance. The most dangerous lies aren't the ones we tell others. They're the ones we tell ourselves to survive. I looked at Clara, at the tears tracing paths down her cheeks, at the genuine grief in her eyes, and wondered which lies she'd told herself to survive, and which ones she was still telling me. Clara, I said carefully, if Eleanor truly believes I'm proof of your betrayal, if she's been manipulating me for months to hurt you, then why send that text just now? Why reveal her hand at this exact moment? It doesn't make strategic sense. Unless I let the sentence hang, watching her face for the reaction I already feared I'd see. Unless what? She whispered. Unless she's not trying to hurt you at all? I said slowly, the realization dawning like cold light through a crack in the wall. Unless she's trying to protect me. From you. Clara's face went perfectly still. Not shocked. Not angry. Just still. Like a pond after a stone has sunk to the bottom, leaving the surface deceptively calm. That's not true, she said, her voice flat, empty of the emotion that had filled it moments before. But the shift was unmistakable. The raw, trembling vulnerability had vanished, replaced by something controlled, calculated. It was the same shift I'd noticed earlier when she'd answered my question about when she first suspected Maya might be Eleanor. A fractional hesitation, a flicker of calculation behind the eyes. And in that moment I knew. I didn't know the full truth. Not yet. But I knew Clara was lying to me. Not about everything. Perhaps not even about the broad strokes of Eleanor's disappearance. But about something essential. Something at the heart of this story. I stood up slowly, placing the locket on the drafting table between us like a judge setting down a gavel. I need to talk to Maya. Clara's head snapped up.
No.
Daniel, you can't. You don't understand what she's capable of. I don't understand what either of you is capable of. I interrupted, my voice firmer than I felt. And that's the problem. For 3 months, I've been caught between you. Feeling distant from you, drawn to her, never understanding why. And now I find out you've both been hiding monumental truths from me. So yes, I'm going to talk to Maya. I'm going to hear her side of this story. And then I'll decide who I believe. I moved toward the studio door. Clara stepped into my path, her arms outstretched not in threat, but in plea. Daniel, please. If you walk out that door, if you go to her, you'll never understand the truth. She'll tell you lies wrapped in half-truths. She'll make me the villain because that's the only role she can give me in her story. But you have to believe me. I never meant to hurt you. I never meant for any of this to happen. Then tell me the whole truth now, I said, stopping inches from her. Not the version that paints you as the victim. Not the version that makes Eleanor the monster. The actual truth. Starting with where you really were the night your sister disappeared. Rain streamed down the window behind her, distorting her face into something fluid and unfamiliar. For a long moment I thought she might break, might collapse under the weight of whatever secret she carried and finally tell me everything. But then she straightened her shoulders. The vulnerability vanished completely, replaced by a quiet resolve that chilled me more than any outburst could have. I can't, she said softly. Not yet. Some truths, they have to be uncovered in the right order, or they destroy everything they touch. It was the second time she'd used that phrase. Destroy everything they touch. And now it sounded less like wisdom and more like a threat. Or a warning she'd been given long ago, perhaps by the mother who'd sworn her to secrecy at 11 years old. I stepped around her and opened the studio door. Cold, rain-scented air rushed in, carrying the scent of wet earth and decaying leaves. The path back to the house was slick with rain, the oak trees swaying ominously in the wind. Daniel, Clara called after me, her voice breaking. If you leave now, I don't know if we can come back from this. I paused on the threshold, my hand on the doorframe. I wanted to turn back, To take her in my arms and tell her we'd figure this out together. That whatever secrets she carried, we could carry them side by side. That was the man I'd been 10 years ago. The man who believed love could withstand any storm. But I wasn't that man anymore. The last hour had carved something essential out of me, leaving a hollow space where trust used to live. I don't know if we can come back from this either, I said without turning around. But I do know this. A marriage built on silence isn't a marriage. It's a museum. And I'm tired of living in a museum of your grief. Then I stepped out into the rain. The walk to the house felt endless. Each step was an act of will. Rain soaked through my shirt within seconds, plastering the fabric to my skin. Water dripped from my hair into my eyes, blurring the familiar path into something alien. Our home. Our home. The sanctuary I'd believed in for a decade loomed ahead, its warm yellow lights glowing through rain-streaked windows like a promise I no longer trusted. I didn't go inside. Not yet. Instead, I stood on the back porch, water pooling around my shoes, and pulled out my phone. My hands shook as I unlocked the screen, scrolled past Clara's contact, Clara, my love, and found the one labeled M. Copywriter. I stared at her name for a full minute, remembering her laugh, the way her eyes crinkled at the corners when she smiled, the comfort of her texts arriving precisely when I needed them most. Had any of it been real, or had every word, every gesture, every moment of connection been engineered to serve an agenda I still didn't understand? I typed a single sentence. We need to talk. Now. I hit send before I could second-guess myself, before fear could convince me to retreat back into the beautiful lie of my marriage. 30 seconds passed. Then a minute. Rain dripped from the porch roof onto my shoulders. Somewhere inside the house, I heard a door open and close, Clara returning from the studio. I didn't turn around. I kept my eyes fixed on my phone screen, waiting. Then it lit up. Maya, I'm at the Willow. Booth in the back. Come alone. The Willow was the cafe where we'd had our first meeting. The place where this entire deception had begun. The symbolism wasn't lost on me, nor, I suspected, on her. I typed back, "Why should I trust you?" Her reply came instantly, as if she'd anticipated the question. "Maya, you shouldn't. But you should trust this. Clara hasn't told you the whole truth about October 17th, 1998. And if you don't hear my side tonight, you'll spend the rest of your life wondering whether the woman you married is who she says she is." I looked toward the kitchen window. Clara stood at the sink, her back to me, shoulders hunched as she washed the ceramic shards from the shattered tray. The domesticity of the scene, the ordinary act of cleaning up broken things, felt surreal against the storm raging inside me. She turned then, as if sensing my gaze, and our eyes met through the rain-streaked glass. She didn't smile, didn't wave, just held my look with an expression I couldn't decipher. Grief? Fear? Resignation? Before turning back to the sink, I made my decision. I typed, "I'm on my way." Then I walked to the garage, started my car, and drove away from the only home I'd known for 10 years without looking back. The Willow Cafe was nearly empty at this hour. A few students hunched over laptops in the corner, a couple sharing a slice of cake by the window. The barista nodded as I entered, shaking rain from my coat. The scent of roasted coffee beans and cinnamon wrapped around me, familiar and comforting. This had been my sanctuary for 3 months, a place where I'd felt understood, seen, known. Now it felt like a stage set, every detail arranged with deliberate precision. And there, in the back booth, the same booth where we'd had our first meeting, sat Maya. She wore the same soft blue sweater from our first encounter, the color of a summer sky on a day that now felt like a lifetime ago. Her hair was damp from the rain, curling slightly at the ends. She looked up as I approached, and her face did something complicated: relief, sorrow, resolve, all flickering across her features in the space of a heartbeat. "Daniel," she said, standing slightly as I reached the table. Not a greeting, an acknowledgement, as if she'd been waiting for this moment her entire life. I slid into the booth opposite her without speaking, without removing my damp coat. I placed my hands flat on the Formica table between us, a barrier, a boundary. Who are you? I asked.
No preamble. No pleasantries.
Just the question that had been burning in my chest since I'd seen her photograph on Clara's drafting table. Maya Eleanor met my gaze without flinching. My name is Eleanor Voss, Clara's sister. I disappeared on October 17, 1998, when I was 14 years old. I was told my sister died in a car accident 3 months later. I spent 28 years believing that, until 6 months ago, when I discovered she was not only alive, but married to a man named Daniel who looked exactly like the kind of man I'd imagined my sister would marry. Her voice was steady, clear, but beneath the calm surface, I heard something else, a current of grief so deep it had carved canyons in her soul. Why come after me? I asked. Why engineer an emotional connection with Clara's husband? Why not just confront her directly? Eleanor's eyes glistened, but she didn't look away. Because I needed to understand her first. I needed to see the life she'd built, the man she'd chosen, the home she'd created before I could face her. And because I needed to know if she'd changed. If the sister who'd betrayed me was still inside the woman who'd lived a full, happy life while I spent decades grieving her death. Betrayed you, I repeated, the word landing like a stone. Clara said you had a fight the afternoon you disappeared. She said you ran away after. I didn't run away, Eleanor interrupted, her voice sharpening for the first time. I was taken. By my own mother. The words hung in the air between us, simple and devastating. Your mother, I whispered. Clara's mother? Why would she? Because of what I saw, Eleanor said, her hands tightening around her coffee mug. The night I disappeared, October 17, 1998, I came downstairs for a glass of water around midnight. Our parents' bedroom door was ajar. I heard voices, my mother's pleading, my stepfather Robert's low and angry. I peeked inside. She paused, swallowing hard. When she continued, her voice was barely audible. Robert wasn't my biological father. Clara's mother had an affair when Clara was an infant. Robert knew. He'd stayed out of some twisted sense of duty. But that night he confronted my mother about it. He was drunk, furious, and he said terrible things about Clara, called her a bastard, said he'd raised another man's child while his own daughter, me, watched from the sidelines. Eleanor's knuckles were white around the mug now. I couldn't stay silent. I burst into the room, screaming at him to leave Clara alone, that she was my sister, and he had no right. He turned on me then, grabbed my arm, shoved me against the wall, and my mother didn't defend me. She just stood there, crying, until Robert finally released me and stormed out. Eleanor looked at me then, her eyes blazing with a grief 28 years in the making. I ran to Clara's room. I needed my sister. I needed her to tell me it would be okay. But when I opened her door, her bed was empty. The rain had softened to a drizzle outside, pattering gently against the cafe windows. Inside, the world had narrowed to this booth, this table, these two people bound by a secret neither had chosen. Clara wasn't in her room? I asked, my throat tight.
No, Eleanor whispered.
She wasn't. And when I went downstairs to look for her, I found her in the kitchen, with Robert, and they were laughing. The word landed like a physical blow. Laughing? I repeated, unable to process the image. Clara and Robert? After what he'd just done to you? Eleanor nodded, a single sharp motion. I stood there in the doorway, frozen. Robert saw me first. His face changed, went from relaxed to calculating. He said, Eleanor. Perfect timing. And Clara wouldn't look at me. She kept her eyes fixed on the floor while Robert explained what was going to happen next. Eleanor took a slow, shuddering breath. He told me I'd misunderstood what I'd seen upstairs, that he and Clara had been close for months, that they had a special relationship I wouldn't understand, and that if I ever told anyone, what I'd seen or heard that night, he would destroy our mother, ruin her reputation, make sure she lost custody of both of us. I felt the blood drain from my face, Clara and Robert? But she was only 10 years old. 10 years old? Eleanor repeated, her voice hollow. Exactly. And Robert knew that. He knew a 10-year-old's word against his would never hold up. Especially not with our mother too fragile to defend either of us. So he created an alternative narrative. That I was the unstable one. The troubled teenager. The one who'd been acting out for months. And Clara played her part perfectly. She nodded when he spoke. She confirmed his lies with a quiet, yes, Daddy, that still haunts my dreams. Eleanor's composure finally broke. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. I ran. Out the back door into the night. I didn't stop running until I reached our aunt's house 3 miles away. I told her everything. And she believed me. But she also knew Robert had powerful friends. Knew he could make our lives hell if we went to the police. So she made a decision. She called our mother. And our mother agreed to a cover story. That I'd run away. That I was unstable. That it was better for everyone if I disappeared. Eleanor looked at me, her eyes raw with decades of betrayal. They didn't just lie to the police, Daniel. They lied to me. They told me Clara had died in a car accident 3 months after I left. They said it was too painful for our mother to maintain contact. They severed me from my sister, the one person I would have fought to protect, and made me believe she was dead. The cafe noise faded into a distant hum. All I could hear was the pounding of my own heart, the ragged rhythm of my breath. I thought of Clara at 11 years old, being sworn to secrecy by her mother. But now I saw a different scene. Not a child being protected from a monster, but a child being recruited by a monster. A child taught to lie to her sister, to betray her, to participate in her exile. Why now? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Why come back after 28 years? Because 6 months ago, I hired a private investigator to look into Clara's death, Eleanor said. I needed closure, and he discovered she wasn't dead. She was alive, married, happy, living a beautiful life in a house with a garden she'd designed herself. A bitter smile touched Eleanor's lips. She'd even kept my locket all these years. Wore it for the first 5 years of your marriage, my investigator told me. A curious detail for a woman who'd supposedly mourned her sister's death. She leaned forward slightly, her gaze intense. I needed to understand how she could do it. How she could live with what she'd done, what she'd allowed to happen, and build a life on that foundation. So I created Maya. I arranged to work with you. I studied you. I learned what made you feel seen, understood, valued. And I gave you those things, not out of malice, Daniel, but out of necessity. I needed to see the man my sister had chosen. I needed to understand what kind of life she'd built on the grave of our sisterhood. Eleanor reached into her purse and withdrew a small, folded photograph. She placed it on the table between us. It showed 2 girls, Clara and Eleanor, unmistakably. Sitting on a porch swing, arms slung around each other's shoulders, heads tilted together in sisterly conspiracy. The same photograph I'd seen on Clara's drafting table. But on the back, someone had written in careful cursive, Clara and Ellie forever sisters. October 16, 1998, the day before Eleanor vanished. I loved her, Eleanor whispered, her voice breaking, more than anything, and she chose him over me. She chose the lie over her sister. And I needed you to know that before you decided whose story to believe. I stared at the photograph, the 2 girls with identical eyes and hopeful smiles, unaware that within 24 hours, their bond would be severed by a lie that would echo for decades. I thought of Clara's tears in the studio, her grief, her fear. Were they genuine? Or were they the performance of a woman who'd spent 28 years perfecting the art of victimhood? And I thought of my own role in all this, not a protagonist but a pawn. A mirror held up to reflect 2 sisters' unresolved war. A man who'd sought comfort in one woman while pulling away from another, never understanding he was being manipulated by both. Clara told me Robert might have hurt you, I said slowly. She said her mother implied he'd done something unforgivable the night you disappeared. Eleanor's expression shifted just slightly. A flicker of something unreadable crossed her face before she smoothed it away. Clara would say that, wouldn't she? It's the perfect narrative. The monster stepfather. The innocent, victimized sister. The fragile mother trying to protect her children. Paints her as blameless. As pure. As the sister who suffered while I was just the unstable one who ran away. But Robert did hurt you, I pressed. He shoved you. He threatened you. Yes, Eleanor admitted. He did. But Clara's version leaves out one crucial detail. Robert never laid a hand on her, because she was his favorite, because she played her part in his little game, and because I think she enjoyed the power it gave her. A 10-year-old girl with a secret only she and the adult in the room shared. A secret that made her special, important, chosen. The words landed with devastating precision. I thought of Clara's need for control, her quiet rooms built inside herself, her hypervigilance, traits that could be born of trauma or of complicity. Where were you the night Eleanor disappeared? I whispered, speaking the question aloud for the first time. Eleanor looked at me, her eyes glistening. Ask her yourself, but be prepared for the answer, because the truth about October 17th, 1998, it doesn't belong to either of us alone. It belongs to all three of us. And it's far darker than either of our stories have admitted. She stood then, sliding the photograph across the table toward me. Keep this. Look at those girls. Remember who they were before the lie broke them. And when you go home tonight, don't ask Clara to confirm or deny my story. Ask her one question. Just one. What question? Eleanor leaned down, her voice dropping to a whisper that sent a chill down my spine. Ask her. What did Robert give you the night Eleanor disappeared? Then she turned and walked away, leaving me alone in the booth with a photograph of two sisters who'd loved each other once, and the dawning, terrible certainty that the woman I'd married had been lying to me from the very beginning. The drive home was a blur of rain-smeared streetlights and fractured thoughts. Eleanor's words echoed in the hollow space between my ears. Ask her what Robert gave you the night Eleanor disappeared. Not where were you, not what did you see, but what did he give you? The specificity of the question haunted me. It implied a transaction, a reward, something tangible exchanged in the aftermath of Eleanor's vanishing. A token sealing Clara's complicity, or perhaps her silence. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles white against the leather. Rain streaked the windshield in erratic patterns, distorting the familiar streets into something alien. This was my neighborhood, the place where I'd walked our dog on Sunday mornings, where I'd waved to neighbors from the porch, where I'd believed my life was simple and good. Now every house felt like a facade hiding secrets behind its cheerful paint and manicured lawns. What did Robert give you? I thought of Clara at 10 years old. Small for her age, serious-eyed, the kind of child who noticed when adults lied but rarely called them on it. I thought of Robert Voss as Eleanor had described him. Not a monster in the cinematic sense, but something more insidious. A man who understood how to manipulate a child's need for approval, for belonging, for love. A man who knew that the most effective lies aren't forced upon us, but offered as gifts we're too young to refuse. And I thought of Clara's locket, the one she'd worn for 5 years of our marriage. The one she'd claimed was a gift from her grandmother. The one that had actually belonged to Eleanor. What did Robert give you? The question coiled in my chest like a serpent, its implications tightening with every mile closer to home. When I pulled into the driveway, the house was dark except for a single lamp burning in the living room. Clara hadn't gone to bed. She was waiting. The sight of that solitary light should have felt like an invitation. A beacon saying, I'm here, we can talk, we can fix this. Instead, it felt like a trap. A stage set for a confrontation neither of us was prepared to have. I sat in the car for 10 minutes after turning off the engine. Rain tapped gently against the roof. My phone remained silent. No texts from Clara, no calls from Eleanor. Just silence. The kind of silence that precedes earthquakes. Finally, I opened the car door and stepped into the damp night air. The scent of wet earth and jasmine from Clara's garden wrapped around me. Familiar, comforting, now tainted with the knowledge that even this beauty might be built on a lie. Every rose she'd planted, Every stone path she'd laid with her own hands. Had she been atoning? Or performing? Was her art an expression of genuine creativity? Or a monument to guilt she could never voice? I let myself in through the back door, the one we always used, the one that opened directly into the kitchen where Clara had once stood with a knife in her hand, chopping vegetables while humming old folk songs. The memory felt like someone else's life. She was waiting at the kitchen table, 2 mugs of tea steaming between her folded hands. She'd changed into soft gray pajamas, her hair pulled back in a loose braid. She looked small, fragile, the Clara I'd fallen in love with. The woman who built gardens and remembered birthdays and filled our home with the scent of rosemary and lemon. But now I saw the performance in her posture, the careful arrangement of vulnerability. The tea mugs placed precisely 6 inches apart, as if she'd measured the distance between us and found it lacking. "Thank you for coming back," she said softly.
No acquiescen.
No demand, just gratitude, offered like a peace offering. I didn't sit. I stood by the counter, my wet coat dripping onto the tile floor. I talked to Eleanor. Clara's hands stilled around her mug. She didn't look surprised, only weary. "I know." She told me a different story about what happened the night she disappeared. I imagined she would. Clara's voice remained calm, but her eyes held a flicker of something. Fear? Calculation? I couldn't name. "Did she tell you I was Robert's favorite? That I conspired with him to exile my own sister? That I enjoyed the power of his secrets?" The accuracy of her summary stole my breath. "You knew what she'd say. I've spent 28 years imagining what she'd say if she ever came back," Clara replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Every night before I fell asleep, I'd rehearse the conversation in my head. I'd prepare my defense. I'd anticipate her accusations. And I'd wake up each morning grateful that today wasn't the day she returned." She looked up at me then, her eyes glistening. "But today was that day. And now you're standing there looking at me like I'm a stranger. Like the woman you married never existed." "The woman I married didn't tell me she had a sister for 10 years," I said, my voice firmer than I felt. "The woman I married let me believe a locket was a gift from her grandmother when it actually belonged to the sister she'd lost. The woman I married watched me pull away from her for 3 months while knowing that her long-lost sister might be the one drawing me away. And she said nothing." Clara flinched as if struck. "I was trying to protect us." "From what?" I asked, the question bursting from me with more force than intended. "From the truth? Because the truth is the one thing that might have saved us, Clara. If you'd told me about Eleanor 6 months ago when you first suspected Maya might be her, if you'd said, 'Daniel, I'm scared my sister might be back and I don't know what she wants,' we could have faced it together. But you chose silence. Again, just like your mother taught you." The reference to her mother landed like a blow. Clara's composure fractured, just slightly, but enough for me to see the raw wound beneath. "My mother was trying to protect us," she whispered. "From what?" I pressed, stepping closer. "From Robert? Or from the truth about what happened that night?" Clara's gaze dropped to the table. Her hands trembled around the mug. For a long moment, I thought she might finally break, that the dam of secrets would crack and the truth would flood out, messy and painful but real. Instead, she lifted her head and met my eyes with a quiet resolve that chilled me. "Sit down, Daniel," she said softly, "and I'll tell you what really happened on October 17th, 1998. I didn't move. Eleanor told me to ask you one question. Just one." Clara's expression shifted, just a flicker, but I saw it. A flash of panic before she smoothed it away. "What question?" I held her gaze, letting the silence stretch between us until it became its own answer. "What did Robert give you the night Eleanor disappeared?" The color drained from Clara's face. Not gradually, instantly, as if someone had pulled a plug and all the blood had rushed out of her at once. Her hands went slack around the mug. It tipped slightly, tea sloshing over the rim onto the tablecloth, a dark stain spreading like a confession. She didn't speak. She just stared at me, her eyes wide with something I'd never seen in them before. Not guilt, not fear, but the dawning horror of being truly known. And in that moment I understood. Eleanor hadn't been lying. Clara hadn't been lying either, not exactly. She'd been telling a version of the truth that painted her as victim rather than participant. A truth that omitted the crucial detail. That on the night her sister vanished, 10-year-old Clara had received a gift from the man who may have harmed her sister. A gift that sealed her silence. A gift that bound her to his secret for the next 28 years. "What did he give you, Clara?" I asked again, my voice barely a whisper. She closed her eyes. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. When she opened them again, they held a grief so profound it made my chest ache. "He gave me a choice," she whispered. The words hung between us, simple and devastating. Not a locket, not money, not a promise, just a choice. Clara's hands twisted in her lap. After Eleanor ran out the back door that night, Robert came to my room. He sat on the edge of my bed, the same bed I'd shared with Eleanor until I was 6, and he told me the truth. Not his truth, not Mother's truth, the truth. She took a shuddering breath. He told me Eleanor hadn't run away. He told me Mother had arranged for her to stay with our aunt in another state. A permanent arrangement, he called it. He told me Eleanor would be told I died in a car accident. And he told me why. Clara's voice dropped to a whisper. Because earlier that evening, before the fight, before everything broke, Eleanor had found Mother's old journals. Journals that proved Robert wasn't my biological father. Journals that described an affair Mother had had when I was an infant. And Eleanor had threatened to tell me. The room seemed to tilt. I gripped the edge of the counter to steady myself. "Robert knew," Clara continued, her voice hollow. "He'd known for years that I wasn't his biological daughter, but he'd stayed. He'd raised me as his own, and he couldn't bear the thought of me learning the truth, not from Eleanor's angry, dramatic telling, but from him. So he made me a choice." She looked at me then, her eyes raw with decades of buried pain. "He said I could have one of two futures. Choice A, Eleanor stays. She tells me the truth about my parentage. I grow up knowing the man who tucked me in at night, who taught me to ride a bike, who carried me on his shoulders at the zoo, wasn't my real father. Choice B, Eleanor leaves. Permanently. I never learn the truth. I get to keep the father I love, the family I know, the childhood I deserve." Clara's tears fell freely now. "He didn't threaten me, Daniel. He didn't force me. He just laid out the options. And he said the decision was mine alone. That I was old enough to understand consequences. That I was the only one who could decide what kind of childhood I wanted to have." She reached up and touched the locket at her throat, the one she'd been wearing again for the past month. "And when I whispered B, he gave me this. Eleanor's locket. He'd taken it from her room after she left. He said it would be my reminder that love sometimes requires sacrifice. That keeping a family together sometimes means letting go of a piece of yourself." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the rain had stopped. The house held its breath. I stared at Clara, the woman I'd loved for a decade, and saw not a villain, not a victim, but a child who'd been handed an impossible choice at 10 years old. A child who'd been manipulated by an adult who understood exactly how to weaponize love. A child who'd spent 28 years carrying the weight of a decision no child should ever have to make. "And you never told Eleanor the truth?" I asked, my voice thick with emotion. "You let her believe you died?" Clara shook her head, a single sharp motion. "I tried. God, I tried. For months after she left, I wrote letters to our aunt's address, dozens of them, begging to see Eleanor, promising I'd tell her everything. But Mother intercepted them all. She said it was too dangerous, that Robert had powerful friends who would ruin us if the truth came out. And eventually, I stopped writing. I buried the guilt. I built a life on top of it. And I told myself it was for the best." She looked at me, her eyes pleading. "Do you understand now? I wasn't Robert's accomplice. I was his victim too, just in a different way. He didn't threaten me with violence. He threatened me with the loss of the only father I'd ever known. And at 10 years old, That felt like the end of the world. I wanted to believe her. I needed to believe her, because the alternative was too devastating to consider. The alternative was that the woman I'd built a life with had knowingly participated in her sister's exile, that she'd chosen comfort over loyalty, that she'd spent 28 years performing grief while secretly relieved her sister was gone. But Clara's story, it rang true in a way Eleanor's hadn't. Not because it painted Clara as blameless, far from it, but because it revealed a more complex, more human truth, that we are all capable of terrible choices when placed in impossible situations, that children don't have the emotional tools to navigate adult manipulations, that the line between victim and accomplice is often blurred beyond recognition. And yet, and the locket? I asked softly. Why tell me it was a gift from your grandmother? Clara's shoulders slumped. Because I was ashamed. Ashamed that the symbol of my greatest failure, the object that represented my betrayal of my sister, had become a part of our marriage. Every time you complimented it, every time you asked about its history, I felt like a fraud. So I created a harmless lie to cover a devastating truth. And the longer I lived with that lie, the harder it became to undo. She reached across the table, her hand trembling as she offered it to me. I am so sorry, Daniel, for the silence, for the lies, for letting you drift toward Eleanor without warning you. I was terrified that if you learned the truth about my past, you'd see me differently, that you'd look at me and see not the woman you married, but the 10-year-old girl who made an impossible choice and spent a lifetime paying for it. I looked at her hand, pale, delicate, the same hand that had held mine through job losses and family deaths and quiet Sunday mornings, and I felt my heart crack open, because I understood then that we were both victims of this story. Clara manipulated as a child into an impossible choice. Eleanor exiled and lied to for decades. And me, I was the collateral damage. The husband who'd sought comfort in one wounded woman while pulling away from another, never understanding I was being used as a pawn in a 28-year-old war. But understanding didn't erase the hurt. It didn't restore the trust that had been shattered in a single afternoon. I didn't take her hand. I need time, I said, my voice barely audible. I need to process all of this, to understand who you really are. Not the Clara I thought I knew, but the whole truth of you. The good and the broken and the complicated. Clara nodded slowly, withdrawing her hand. I understand. No, I said gently. I don't think you do, because I'm not just processing your past, Clara. I'm processing the fact that for 10 years, I've been married to a woman who kept the most defining trauma of her life hidden from me, who watched me become emotionally entangled with her sister and said nothing, who built our entire relationship on a foundation of silence. I stood up, my legs unsteady beneath me. I love you. God help me, I still love you. But love isn't enough when trust is gone. And right now, I don't know if I can ever trust you again. Clara's face crumpled. Not with anger, not with defensiveness, with a grief so profound it seemed to hollow her out from the inside. Where will you go? She whispered. I hadn't planned that far ahead. But in that moment I knew. I'll stay at Ben's apartment for a few days. Just until I can think clearly. Ben was my oldest friend, the one person who knew both Clara and me well enough to remain neutral. The one person I could talk to without fear of judgment. Clara nodded again, tears streaming silently down her face. She didn't beg me to stay, didn't make promises she couldn't keep. Just sat there in the quiet kitchen, surrounded by the remnants of our life together, looking smaller than I'd ever seen her. I walked upstairs and packed a bag with mechanical efficiency. Clothes, toiletries, my laptop. I moved through our bedroom like a ghost, touching objects that had once felt sacred. The quilt Clara's mother had made for our wedding, the photograph of us laughing on a beach in Maine, the bookshelf filled with novels we'd read aloud to each other on winter nights. Each item felt like a relic from a civilization that had collapsed overnight. As I zipped my suitcase, my eyes fell on the jewelry box on Clara's nightstand. On top of it sat the second locket, the one I'd found in her studio, the one containing Eleanor's photograph. I picked it up, the silver cool against my palm. I could leave it Let Clara keep both lockets, the symbol of her choice and the ghost of her sister. But something in me rebelled against that. This locket wasn't just Clara's burden to carry. It was Eleanor's too. And perhaps, in some small way, it was mine now as well. A tangible reminder that some wounds never fully heal, but must be carried forward with honesty rather than buried in silence. I slipped the locket into my pocket. When I came downstairs, Clara was still at the kitchen table. She hadn't moved. The tea had gone cold. The stain on the tablecloth had dried to a dark brown. "I'll call you in a few days," I said from the doorway. She looked up, her eyes red-rimmed but clear. "Daniel." "Yes. However this ends, whatever you decide, I need you to know one thing. I waited. I never stopped loving you. Not for a single day. Even when I was lying. Even when I was silent. Even when I was watching you pull away and saying nothing. I loved you. I love you still." The words should have comforted me. Instead, they broke something open inside my chest. A grief not just for our marriage, but for the beautiful, complicated woman who'd been shaped by a trauma she never chose. "I know," I whispered, and then I walked out the front door, closing it softly behind me. The night air was cool and clean after the rain. Stars glittered through breaks in the clouds. Our street was quiet. No cars, no voices, just the gentle rustle of oak leaves in the breeze. I stood on the porch for a moment, looking back at the house that had been my home for 10 years. The warm yellow light still burned in the living room window, a beacon for a ship that had already sailed. I got in my car and drove away without looking back. Ben's apartment was a sterile one-bedroom on the 3rd floor of a modern complex. Nothing like our warm, plant-filled home with its rosemary and lemon scent and shelves of well-loved books. But it was neutral territory, a place to think. I unpacked my bag mechanically, hung my clothes in the empty closet, placed my toothbrush beside Ben's in the bathroom cup. Then I sat on the edge of the guest bed and pulled the locket from my pocket. I flipped it open. Eleanor's young face stared back at me, defiant, wounded, already carrying the weight of a betrayal she couldn't yet name. I thought of her at 14, running through the night toward an aunt's house 3 miles away, believing she was protecting her sister. I thought of her spending 28 years believing that sister was dead. I thought of her creating Maya not out of malice, but out of a desperate need to understand how the sister she'd loved could have participated in her exile. And I thought of Clara at 10, small, serious-eyed, handed an impossible choice by an adult who should have protected her rather than manipulated her. A child who'd chosen the father she knew over the truth she feared. A child who'd spent a lifetime carrying the weight of that choice in silence. Neither woman was wholly innocent. Neither was wholly guilty. They were just two sisters shattered by a lie, each carrying a different piece of the truth, each believing the other had betrayed her first. And I was the man who'd loved one sister while being drawn to the other, never understanding I was walking through a minefield of 28-year-old grief. I closed the locket and held it in my palm, the silver warming against my skin. For the first time since discovering the photographs in Clara's studio, I felt a flicker of something other than confusion or pain. Clarity. The truth wasn't a single story to be uncovered. It was a mosaic, fragments of memory, perspective, pain, held by different people who had all been wounded by the same event. Clara's truth, Eleanor's truth, Robert's truth, their mother's truth. None complete, none entirely reliable, but all necessary to understand what had really happened on October 17, 1998. And my truth, the truth of a man who'd believed his marriage was built on trust, only to discover it was built on silence, was just one more fragment in that mosaic. I didn't know if Clara and I could rebuild what we'd lost. I didn't know if Eleanor would ever forgive her sister. I didn't know if any of us could move forward without carrying these wounds into whatever came next. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Silence had broken us. Only truth, messy, painful, incomplete truth, could possibly put us back together again. I placed the locket on the nightstand beside Ben's spare bed. Then I lay down in the dark, staring at the ceiling, and let myself feel the full weight of my grief. Not just for my marriage, but for two sisters who'd loved each other once, before a lie came between them and stole 28 years they could never get back. Outside, the city hummed with its ordinary rhythms. Cars passing, distant laughter, the gentle sigh of wind through unfamiliar trees. And in that strange room, surrounded by the echoes of other people's lives, I began the long, slow work of deciding who I wanted to be on the other side of this truth. 3 days passed in Ben's apartment like a slow tide receding. I didn't sleep much. I'd lie awake until dawn, staring at the water-stained patterns on the ceiling that vaguely resembled continents on a map of a world I no longer recognized. During the day, I walked. I walked through neighborhoods I'd never visited, past houses with open windows where families argued over breakfast or laughed at shared jokes. Ordinary lives built on foundations I now questioned. I walked until my feet ached and my mind grew quiet enough to hear my own thoughts beneath the storm of confusion. And I thought, not about who was right or wrong, Clara or Eleanor, but about the nature of truth itself. I'd always believed truth was singular, a fixed point you could navigate toward if you were brave enough to face it. But this experience had shattered that illusion. Truth wasn't a destination. It was a landscape, vast, uneven, viewed differently depending on where you stood within it. Clara stood in the valley of her childhood trauma, seeing Robert as the manipulator who'd weaponized her love. Eleanor stood on the mountain of her exile, seeing Clara as the sister who'd chosen comfort over loyalty. Both perspectives were true. Both were incomplete. And the actual events of October 17, 1998, the objective reality, was buried somewhere beneath 28 years of grief, silence, and self-preservation. On the morning of the 4th day, my phone rang. Not a text, a call. The screen displayed a name I hadn't seen in years. Helen Miller, Clara's mother. I almost didn't answer, but something in me, the part that had always sought understanding over judgment, made me press accept. Daniel. Her voice came through, thin and aged but steady. Thank you for taking my call. Clara told you what happened? I asked. She told me enough. A pause. The soft rustle of fabric as she shifted the phone. I need to see you. There are things I should have said 28 years ago. Things I owe to both my daughters and to you. We agreed to meet at a public garden downtown. A neutral space, open and sunlit, where conversations couldn't hide in shadows. Helen was waiting on a wrought iron bench beneath a magnolia tree, its blossoms just beginning to unfurl. She was smaller than I remembered, fragile-boned, her silver hair pulled back in a simple clip. At 74, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that couldn't conceal the weight she'd carried for decades. Thank you for coming, she said as I sat beside her. Not across from her, beside her, a subtle choice that spoke volumes. I wasn't sure I would, I admitted. I understand. She looked out at the garden, Clara's domain, though she didn't know it yet. My daughter designs spaces like this. She creates beauty from emptiness. I've always thought that was her way of healing what she couldn't fix in herself. We sat in silence for a moment, watching a bee drift from blossom to blossom. Clara told me about the choice Robert gave her, I said finally. About the 2 futures he laid out for her that night. Helen's hands tightened slightly in her lap. She told you that? She did. Helen took a slow breath. It's true. Every word. Robert came to me first, hours before he went to Clara's room. He told me Eleanor had discovered the journals, that she was threatening to tell Clara the truth about her parentage. And he said we had 2 options. Let Eleanor tell Clara and risk destroying the family Clara knew, or send Eleanor away and let Clara keep her childhood intact. She turned to me then, her eyes clear and unflinching. I chose Eleanor's exile, not Robert. Me. I made the call to my sister. I packed Eleanor's bag while she slept. I told the police she'd run away. I let Robert frame it as his idea because I couldn't bear for Clara to see her mother as the monster in the story. I wanted her to have someone to blame besides me. The confession hung between us, simple and devastating. For 28 years, Clara had carried the weight of a choice she'd been manipulated into making. But the true architect of her sister's exile had been the mother who'd believed protecting one daughter required sacrificing the other. Why? I asked softly. Why not just tell Clara the truth? She was 10. Children understand more than we give them credit for. Helen's eyes glistened. Because I was a coward, Daniel. Plain and simple. Robert had been my rock through poverty, through illness, through the shame of my affair. He'd stayed when most men would have left. And when Eleanor threatened to destroy that, I chose the man who'd stood by me over the daughter who challenged me. It was the greatest failure of my life, and I have lived with it every single day since. She reached into her purse and withdrew a small, worn photograph. She handed it to me. It showed a young Helen, maybe 30, holding 2 infants, one in each arm. Clara and Eleanor, just months old, identical in their swaddling blankets, their tiny fists curled around their mother's fingers. I loved them equally, Helen whispered, but I failed them differently. I failed Eleanor by sending her away. I failed Clara by burdening her with a secret she was too young to carry. And I failed myself by believing a lie could protect anyone. She looked at me, her gaze steady. Clara has spent her life believing she made an impossible choice that night. But the truth is, she was never given a real choice at all. Robert presented her with 2 terrible options and called it agency. But a child offered a choice between 2 wounds isn't making a decision. She's being manipulated. Helen placed her hand over mine. Her skin was papery thin, cool against my warmth. I'm telling you this not to excuse what happened, not to shift blame, but because you deserve to understand the full landscape of this tragedy. Clara isn't a villain. She's a wounded child who grew into a woman who built beautiful gardens to atone for a sin that was never hers to carry. We sat together for a long time after that, the sun warming our shoulders, the scent of magnolia blossoms hanging in the air. Helen didn't ask me to forgive her, didn't ask me to stay with Clara. She simply offered the truth, raw, unvarnished, and decades overdue, and trusted me to do with it what I needed to do. When I left the garden, I didn't feel healed. But I felt oriented, like a traveler who'd been lost in fog suddenly seeing the mountains on the horizon. The path forward was still unclear, but at least I knew which direction to face. That evening, I drove to Eleanor's apartment building, a modest brick complex on the edge of the city. I hadn't texted ahead. I just stood outside her door, heart hammering, and pressed the buzzer. She answered within seconds, as if she'd been waiting. She wore jeans and a simple white t-shirt, no performance, no Maya persona. Just Eleanor, older than the girl in the photograph, her face lined with years of grief, but her eyes still holding that defiant spark. "You came," she said. Not a question, a statement. I did. She stepped aside to let me in. The apartment was sparse, minimal furniture, few personal touches. A life built for mobility, for escape. "I spoke with Helen today," I said as I sat on her couch. "Your mother." Eleanor stiffened slightly. "And she told me the truth. About who really made the decision to send you away. About Robert's manipulation of Clara. About her own cowardice." Eleanor's expression didn't change, but something in her posture softened. A slight unclenching of shoulders that had been braced for decades. "I know," she said quietly. "I've known for years. My aunt told me everything before she died. I needed Clara to admit her part too. Not because I wanted to punish her, but because I needed to know she understood what she'd done." "She didn't understand," I said gently. "Not really. She was 10 years old, Eleanor. Robert weaponized her love for him. He made her believe she was choosing her childhood when really, he was stealing yours." Eleanor looked away, toward the window where city lights glittered like scattered stars. "I know that now, intellectually, but the wound doesn't care about intellectual understanding. It only knows it was abandoned by the one person who should have fought for me." "I know," I whispered, and I did, because I'd felt that same abandonment. Not by Clara's actions, but by her silence. The silence that had made me seek comfort elsewhere. The silence that had nearly destroyed us. We sat together in the quiet apartment, 2 wounded people bound by a third. After a long silence, Eleanor spoke again, her voice barely audible. "Do you think we can ever be sisters again?" I thought of the photograph in my pocket. The two girls on the porch swing, arms slung around each other's shoulders, heads tilted together in sisterly conspiracy. I thought of Clara's hands trembling around her tea mug. I thought of Helen's confession beneath the magnolia tree. "No," I said honestly. "Not the sisters you were before October 17th, 1998. That bond was broken by a lie neither of you created but both of you inherited. You can't rebuild what was lost." Eleanor's shoulders slumped slightly. "But I wasn't finished." "But you can build something new," I continued. "Something honest. Something that acknowledges the wound without pretending it doesn't exist. It won't look like the sisterhood you remember. It might not even look like sisterhood at all at first. It might look like two strangers learning each other's truths. But it can be real. And real is better than perfect." Eleanor looked at me then, really looked at me, and for the first time I saw not the avenger or the victim, but simply a woman carrying a grief she was finally ready to set down. "Thank you," she whispered. "I stayed another hour. We didn't solve anything. Didn't promise reconciliation. Just talked about small things, ordinary things. The book she was reading. The cafe she liked for morning coffee. The way she'd learned to garden on her fire escape because she missed the earth beneath her hands. Human details. The building blocks of a future relationship, however fragile. When I left her apartment, the city felt different. Not healed, but possible. I drove home that night, not to Ben's apartment, but to the house Clara and I had built together. I didn't know if she'd be there. Didn't know if she'd want me there. But I knew I couldn't move forward without facing the space where our life had lived. The house was dark when I pulled into the driveway. But as I stepped onto the porch, the front door opened. Clara stood silhouetted in the warm light from within. She wore the same gray pajamas from the night I'd left. Her hair was loose around her shoulders. She looked exhausted, fragile, real. "You came back," she said. Not a question. A breath held and released. "I did." She stepped aside to let me in. The house smelled exactly as it always had, rosemary and lemon, with the faintest hint of jasmine from the garden she'd planted with her own hands. But everything felt different now. Not broken, just seen. Fully seen, with all its cracks and shadows exposed to the light. We stood in the entryway for a long moment. Two people who'd shared a decade of life now standing on opposite sides of a chasm neither had chosen. "I spoke with your mother today," I said finally. Clara's eyes widened slightly. "She told you." "She told me the truth. About who really made the decision that night. About Robert's manipulation. About her own role." Clara nodded slowly, tears welling in her eyes. "I didn't know. Not until recently. She confessed to me 6 months ago, right after I received Eleanor's first letter. She said she couldn't let me carry that burden any longer. That the truth was mine to know, even if it broke me. She said you've spent your life believing you made a choice that was never really yours to make." Clara's composure finally broke. She sank onto the bottom step of the staircase, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. I sat beside her, not touching her, but close enough that our knees almost brushed. "I'm so tired, Daniel," she whispered. "Tired of carrying a secret that wasn't mine. Tired of performing grief for a sister I thought was dead. Tired of building a beautiful life on a foundation of silence." "I know," I said, and I did, because I'd been tired too. Tired of the distance between us, tired of seeking comfort in shadows, tired of loving a woman I realized I'd never truly known. We sat together in the quiet house as night deepened outside. No grand declarations, no promises of easy forgiveness. Just two people sitting in the wreckage of their shared life, finally seeing each other clearly for the first time. After a long silence, Clara spoke again, her voice barely audible. "I don't expect you to stay. I don't expect us to go back to what we were. But if you're willing, I'd like to try building something new, something honest, even if it's messy, even if it takes years." I looked at her then, not at the wife I'd thought I knew, but at the whole woman. The child who'd been manipulated, the sister who'd grieved in silence, the artist who built beauty from emptiness, The woman who'd loved me even while lying to me. Flawed. Human. Wounded. Real. I don't know if I can trust you again, I said honestly. Not the way I did before. That trust was built on a foundation that wasn't real. But I think I can learn to trust the woman you are now. The one who's finally telling the truth. Even when it hurts. Clara looked at me, her eyes glistening with tears. That's all I'm asking for. A chance to be known. Fully. Honestly. Even the broken parts. I reached out then and took her hand. Not as a promise of reconciliation. Not as a return to what was. But as an acknowledgement. I see you. All of you. And I'm still here. Her fingers closed around mine. Tentative at first, then firmer. A bridge across the chasm. We didn't sleep together that night. I took the guest room. She stayed in our bedroom. But before I left the living room, I placed the locket, the one with Eleanor's photograph, on the coffee table between us. A reminder, I said softly, not of the lie that broke us, but of the truth that might rebuild us. Clara picked it up, her thumb stroking the tarnished silver. Thank you, she whispered. The next morning, I woke early and walked through the garden Clara had designed. The winding stone paths, the clusters of lavender and rosemary, the small bench beneath the oak tree where she'd often sit to sketch. I understood now that every plant, every curve of the path, had been an act of atonement. A silent prayer for a sister she believed dead. A monument to grief she couldn't voice. I found her already in the garden, kneeling beside a bed of newly planted tulips, her hands deep in the rich, dark soil. I've been thinking, I said, sitting beside her on the damp grass, about what comes next. She looked up, her face open and vulnerable. And I think we need to invite Eleanor here, not to force reconciliation, not to perform some grand healing moment, but to sit in this garden, the space you built while believing she was gone, and simply be in the same room, to see each other as adults, to acknowledge the wound without pretending it doesn't exist. Clara's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. I'd like that. And I think, I continued, that we need to stop building our relationship on silence. No more secrets, no more hidden rooms, even the painful truths, especially the painful truths. Clara reached out and took my hand, soil still clinging to her fingers. I promise, no more silence. We sat together in the morning sun, hands clasped, watching bees drift between blossoms. The path ahead wouldn't be easy. Trust would have to be rebuilt brick by brick. The sisters' relationship would require years of honest conversation, if it could be repaired at all. And our marriage would never be what it was before. That version of us had died in Clara's studio the moment I'd picked up that locket. But something new could grow in its place. Something built not on the illusion of perfection, but on the courage of truth. Something fragile but real. Something that acknowledged the wounds without being defined by them. As the sun climbed higher, warming our shoulders, I realized something fundamental had shifted inside me. For the first time since discovering the photographs, I felt not confusion or pain, but a quiet sense of purpose. The affair, the emotional entanglement with Maya, hadn't been a betrayal of Clara so much as a symptom of our shared silence. A desperate grasp for connection in a marriage that had stopped speaking its truth. And in that realization lay my own growth. I had sought validation outside my marriage because I'd stopped believing my wife could truly see me. But the problem hadn't been Clara's inability to see me. It had been my unwillingness to show her my full self, shadows and all. We'd both been hiding, both performing, both building a beautiful museum of curated happiness, while the real, messy, complicated truth festered in the basement. No more. I looked at Clara, her hands in the soil, her face turned toward the sun, the locket resting against her collarbone. And I saw not the woman I'd married, but the woman she was becoming. Someone brave enough to face her past, honest enough to admit her failures, and strong enough to build something new from the wreckage. I love you, I said softly, not as a promise, not as a demand, just as a statement of fact, simple, unadorned, true. Clara turned to me, her eyes clear and unflinching. I love you too, not the man I thought you were, but the man you are, flawed, wounded, honest. That man I can build a life with. We didn't kiss, didn't embrace, just sat together in the garden we built on silence, beginning the long, slow work of replanting it with truth. And as the morning deepened around us, I understood the final lesson of this painful journey. That love isn't about finding someone perfect to share your life with. It's about finding someone brave enough to face the broken pieces of your history and having the courage to face theirs in return. That trust isn't the absence of betrayal, but the willingness to rebuild after truth has shattered the illusion of safety. And that the most beautiful gardens aren't those without weeds, but those where every plant, beautiful and thorny alike, is allowed to grow in the honest light of day. The road ahead would be long. There would be days when the old wounds ached, days when silence would tempt us again, days when Eleanor's presence would stir up grief we thought we'd processed. But for the first time, I believed we could walk that road together, not as the people we'd pretended to be, but as the flawed, complicated, beautifully human people we actually were. And that, I realized as Clara's hand tightened around mine, was enough. More than enough. It was everything. The end.